Now there is a bit of a danger. We tend to kaleidoscope history. Later in the war, of course, the Germans get their Tigers, King Tigers and Panther tanks. If we're playing top trumps, tank for tank, of course they're going to win every time. Certainly the Sherman is no match that way. But that's not how they thought, or the Western Allies thought they were going to fight the war. It was a numbers game. And just to give you some idea, that famous Tiger 1 tank you can see inside the museum that we sometimes run, 1,300 Tigers are made in the Second World War. The Americans made over 50,000 Sherman tanks. So basically the German quality was going to be sunk by American quantity. And it was pretty similar on the Eastern Front, where the T-34 tank, lots and lots of those made to, again, swamp the numbers of German tanks that were there. Now that's pretty rough on a tank crew. If you're an Allied tank crewman, you may lose 3 or 4 Shermans knocking out that one German tank, but there was always more Shermans to come. The Germans simply couldn't replace their very expensive, very big Tiger tanks quickly enough. Now inside this Sherman, there's a crew of 5, 3 guys in the turret, commander obviously in charge again, up the top there, he's reporting down, he's telling the driver where to go all the time because he can see further. On the other side of the turret, from the commander, is a loader. And if you ever have to choose a tank crew, always pick a loader who's short, stocky, built like a Russian shot putter, because the rate of fire of this tank will simply go down as the loader's quite simply getting knackered by whacking those rounds in the breech. In front of the commander in the turret sits the gunner. He's the one with the periscope with the crosshairs on, and when he's aimed that 76mm gun on this particular tank, it's made later in the war, slightly bigger gun, when he's aimed it, he presses on a foot pedal and that actually fires that gun. As you face the tank, on the right-hand side at the very front is the driver, and again he's got those 2 levers, and on the other side at the front is the co-driver or bow machine gunner. And the idea there, he can't drive from that position, he can use the machine gun, but you're always trained to take over another role. So driving a tank is very tiring, very stressful. So if you've got something like a night drive, you've got someone who can take over from you at the right moment. And most tank crews are taught to at least carry out 2 roles in the vehicle. So if one of you's wounded, one of you's away, someone else can take over that role. So a very compact space inside a vehicle like this. This particular Sherman, it was made later in the war, so it's got this slightly bigger 76mm gun, high velocity gun, because they realised they were going to be fighting lots of tanks, and now they wanted a more powerful weapon for smashing those armour-piercing rounds into the German tanks. And this particular Sherman as well, it's got a diesel engine in it. The Americans simply made so many Shermans, they couldn't make enough of one type of engine. And this one's got a diesel, some of them had petrol engines. And again, there's a bit of a rumour as well, a bit of a myth that they called Sherman tanks Tommy Cookers or Ronsons because of the petrol engines setting on fire. The truth was, most of the fires that a Sherman had when it was hit, it's the ammunition inside catching fire. So later in the war they tended to weld extra plates of armour on the side of the Shermans to protect where the ammunition was stowed. Now the engine's in the back, and that engine powers those 2 sprocketed wheels at the front. So the driver sits right next to the gearbox. And changing gear on a tank like this, it's not anything like in your car. You need about 60 pounds of pressure to literally stamp down on the clutch to disengage the clutch plates. And then there's this terrible task of trying to get the gear lever. It's what they call a crash gearbox. So sometimes you hear this awful noise of the teeth grinding together as you're trying to get into the gear in the tank. And sometimes on the Russian vehicles, their gearboxes were so crude, you actually needed a hammer to whack the gear lever into the right gear as you were driving around. Now, one of the advantages actually that the Sherman did have over those big heavy German tanks is the turret. The turret is powered, so were the German tanks, but this was a lot quicker to turn all the way round. So the idea was, one of the tank tactics that they practiced was, if you can speed up to where the German tanks are, aim your gun very quickly to fire and then move off quickly, you had an advantage, because some of the bigger German tanks, they took a whole minute to turn their turrets round to aim at the target. So that was one of the advantages Sherman had. But again, you can imagine, you've got to be some pretty brave boys to try those tactics out in practice against something like a Tiger. Now the bit on the end of the barrel there, that little bit called there we are, waking you up now. The little bit on the end of the barrel, that's a muzzle brake. And the idea of that bit on the end is when a gun fires, the round comes out at tremendous force. And if you imagine when you've seen a cannon fire, it goes backwards. The recoil of the gun makes the gun go backwards. Now if you capture some of the gas coming out in that muzzle brake at the end, it pulls the gun forward. So what the muzzle brake's trying to do is it's pulling the gun back in the other direction so it doesn't recoil too far into the turret. And muzzle brakes can actually reduce the recoil of a gun by up to 50%. As I said, this particular Sherman, it was made late in the war. It shows lots of improvements, wider tracks, bigger gun. It was actually used by the Canadian Army, and it came down here some years ago as a gift from the Canadian Army. And we run it most summers here. We've only rebuilt the engine once, and it's a prime example of how good a reliable vehicle the Sherman is, that we can still come bring it out now every summer and drive it around here. And